Bangladesh is currently engulfed in widespread protests, initially sparked by a court decision reinstating a controversial job quota for descendants of freedom fighters. These protests have since morphed into a broader movement against perceived government authoritarianism and economic mismanagement. This video will explore the origins, developments, and potential consequences of these protests.
The recent wave of protests began after a high court verdict on June 5, 2024, which reinstated a 30% job quota for freedom fighters' descendants. This decision reversed the government's 2018 abolition of the quota system following significant student agitation. Dissatisfaction with the reinstatement led to renewed protests, particularly among university students, who see the quota system as unfair and discriminatory.
The protests, which started peacefully, quickly escalated due to the government's heavy-handed response. Students from various public and private universities across Dhaka and other major cities took to the streets. The government's crackdown, involving the deployment of police, border guards, and the military, resulted in significant violence. As of mid-July, over 114 people, mostly students, had been killed, with many more injured.
The government's response has included closing educational institutions, implementing internet blackouts, and imposing curfews. Despite these measures, the protests have continued to grow, fueled by broader discontent with the government's authoritarian tendencies and economic struggles.
The protests have highlighted deep-seated issues in Bangladesh, including economic instability and the lack of democratic avenues for change. The current administration, led by the Awami League, has been accused of election rigging and suppressing dissent. The violent suppression of peaceful protests has drawn international condemnation, with organizations like Amnesty International calling for an end to the unlawful use of force.
The protests and subsequent government actions have significantly disrupted daily life in Bangladesh. Major transportation networks, including trains and roadways, have been affected. The temporary suspension of mobile internet services has further isolated the country, complicating communication and coordination among protesters.
The international community has been closely monitoring the situation in Bangladesh. Human rights organizations have criticized the government's use of force and called for restraint. The UN guidelines on the use of less lethal weapons have been cited in condemning the police's actions, particularly the use of tear gas and rubber bullets against unarmed protesters.
The protests have also had significant political ramifications. Opposition parties, particularly the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, have aligned themselves with the protesters, hoping to capitalize on the public's dissatisfaction with the government. This alignment has further polarized the political landscape, leading to increased tensions and sporadic clashes between government supporters and opposition activists.
As the protests continue, the future of Bangladesh remains uncertain. The government's willingness to engage in dialogue with the protesters, as indicated by recent statements from the law minister, may provide a pathway to de-escalation. However, the deep-rooted issues driving the protests, including economic grievances and demands for democratic reforms, will require substantial and sustained efforts to address.
The ongoing protests in Bangladesh represent a critical juncture in the country's political and social landscape. The outcome of these protests could shape the future of Bangladesh, either leading to significant reforms or further entrenching the current government's authoritarian practices. It is crucial for the government to listen to the voices of its citizens and work towards a peaceful and just resolution to the current crisis.